a few poisonings in the occupied territories. And I have to think that women have more access to the kitchens.
The Russians don't suspect pretty young women who get their nails done and have all of their, and have their hair and everything. And so some of these women who seem like perhaps the least likely resistance fighters have managed to both smuggle in terms of phones, in terms of sometimes equipment, but also just to get information out, for example, to the Ukrainian special operations forces that work with the partisans within the occupied territories.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time, to coincide with International Women's Day, we're looking at the price paid by women in the war in Ukraine. Joining me from Ukraine, from Kharkiv, is Dr. Jade McGlynn, a research fellow from the Department of War Studies at King's College London, an author of Memory Makers, The Politics of the Past in Putin's Russia and Russia's War, and the award-winning journalist Diane Francis, who has her own Substack, writing on geopolitics, including the war in Ukraine and President Putin. She's also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington and editor-at-large with the National Post newspaper. Welcome to both of you. Jade, on this visit to Ukraine, you're currently in Kharkiv. You've been spending time also in parts of the Donbass, and you've been looking at the Russian indoctrination, the challenges of the front line and morale. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the women you've come across and how their lives have changed in the last 2 years?
Thank you for having me, first of all. Yeah, so I've travelled across the country over the last sort of 3 to 4 weeks. And of course, the women are instrumental to the military effort, sometimes as soldiers. I was speaking with a friend of a female sniper and hearing about how, she turned up in the first she turned up on the first day of the full-scale invasion. They told her to basically, go home. They were quite dismissive of her. She turned up on the second day, similar thing. And on the third day, they were like, okay, no, let's try. She tried out some different things. It turned out she was very good at shooting, and now she's a super sniper. And I think this war has shown, though I think people knew it anyway, as I imagine Diane will talk about, just how capable Ukrainian women are. And also, I think one of the things that I always find interesting in the polling that comes out of Ukraine now is that it's actually the women who are most strongly opposed to Russia and to Russians. So as usual, the women here are the toughest.
Diane, you know Ukraine very well yourself, having travelled there numerous times over 3 decades. If we rewind the clock back to when you first went there after the vote of independence in 1991, what were women's lives like then, and how much optimism was there after the fall of the Soviet Union?
Well, optimism was there because they had been the first Soviet republic to opt to become independent. And as a result of their departure, and it was widely, approved by women and men alike, excuse me, because Ukrainians are not Russians, and Russians are brutal compared to Ukrainians. They were now independent and out from under the Russians, and their departure led to the complete dissolution of the Soviet Union. The other republics left. And so people's lives there were pretty grim because poverty was widespread in the former Soviet Union, still is in much of Russia. And so there was not a feeling of exhilaration because they're pretty realistic. But women were part and parcel of the decision-making and the voting. And I think it's a uniquely feminist culture ethnically, certainly compared to its neighboring cultures and Russia. I point to the fact that in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, women have been allowed in the sanctuary for decades, and only recently allowed in the sanctuaries in Russian Orthodox churches. And the marriage vows in Ukraine have been love and honor, not obey. And so there's a lot more feminism in that country than people think. So the women have been very empowered.
And just to expand on that, Diane, last time you spoke to us, you said Russia had a history of abusing Ukraine, using the people in the country for its own interests. I think you'd uphold the view, well, I know you think the war is genocidal. Can you talk us through some of the horrifying ways that Ukrainian women have fallen victim to that?
Well, I think the whole populace has been victimized. It was a colony of Moscow's, just as there still are other colonies that should be liberated as well. The difference was the Ukrainians were unanimous in their desire and their unanimity and cohesiveness. And the fact their culture was so different than the Russian culture to get out from under it. And took them a long time, but they did. And so, but during this war, war crimes consist of rape and torture and kidnapping women and all kinds of things that are dreadful, not unique to Russia, unfortunately.
Jade, during your travels, what stories have women told you about the way that they have been treated?
So I spend a lot of time in the deoccupied territories, and there you hear very difficult stories about rapes, including of elderly ladies. You hear stories from people whose families are still under occupation, of children being taken away, which as a mom is just completely impossible to imagine. Often there are threats to take the children away for, basically for not taking a Russian passport, which again goes back, I think, very symbolically to Diane's point about this really is a genocidal war. It's a war about stealing people's identity and stealing people's children to then Russify them and to give them new identity so they can't be found. And we know that that's happened to a number of Ukrainian orphans or children that Russia presumes are orphans, but may well not be. They may have family in other parts, kind of flung apart by the chaos of the war and the chaos of destruction. And I think that what Ukrainian mothers in particular, of course, not all women are mothers. There's lots of different ways that women are making their sort of impact in this war, but I often can't help but think about how difficult it is anyway, even in the best of conditions, sometimes to be a mum, and how incredibly difficult that is when there are air raid alarms constantly. We're already on our 6th air alarm today here in Kharkiv, and sometimes when you see the little children's faces when the air raid alarm goes off, it's entirely heartbreaking. And I think that, of course, there are all of these wondrous stories of this great Ukrainian heroism, female heroism, and they're really important and outstanding, but also just that everyday heroism of just bringing up a child who's terrified by air raid alarms and getting on and somehow, doing the best you can. I think also, I don't know, I'd like it to be recognized as well.
I'd also like to add the heroism of the 6.5 or 7 million women and children from Ukraine that evacuated themselves. And we're talking about millions of single parent moms who are in foreign countries, making a living, raising their kids, and worried about their husbands, brothers, and fathers. This is heroic as well. And they are very, very much to be applauded for what they've done.
And there are also stories of women who've actually returned to Ukraine because they actually can't bear the separation as well. Falling short of the mobilization of women, Diane, their contribution to the war effort is everywhere, isn't it? And the numbers of those wanting to join the armed forces has understandably grown exponentially. There have been reports in the Times newspaper of women signing up to train as drone operators on this specially designed course for women. There are people joining volunteer battalions. We had the example that Jade was telling us about, the sniper and journalists risking their lives to counter the Russian disinformation. Of all those wartime contributions, Diane, what has struck you the most?
Well, I think that first of all, they have a unique work ethic, Ukrainians in general, and they have a great education. The other thing that Ukraine has going for it is that it has education that was very feminist oriented. I mean, women could go as far in the educational system as they wanted to. All little girls were educated. I'm not sure that's the case throughout Russia, and certainly not in the rest of the world. And so they had a lot of brain power and a lot of talent and knowledge and involvement from the fact that they were fully participating in the country. And the IT sector was one of the most successful in the world before the war, and that was probably equally populated. In fact, I was involved in software development, had Ukrainian partners, and most of them were women. And so, yes, of course, they're involved in drones. The women that are living in Europe who have evacuated are also working in pop-up factories that the U.S. Defense Department has created in Romania, Poland, making bullets and weapons and uniforms and whatever is needed. And they're working very hard, and they can't get over how smart they are and how hardworking they are. So the war effort is just a total all-in situation.
Another article that was published in the Times newspaper told about a Ukrainian risk assessment and analysis firm called Molfar, which hires women to go on dating apps and lure Russian soldiers into disclosing information which can then be used for intelligence gathering. What other instances are you aware of women helping subvert the Russian war effort?
Well, by the way, there was a recent story also in reverse about a honeypot operation using Russian women to get on dating apps with American men, and a serviceman was just arrested for giving up, excuse me, confidential military information. Unfortunately, we're bait. But even if that works, women are used in all kinds of respects. They're designing robots. They're coming up with apps. They're creating a Game Boy war where a soldier can go out in the jungle with a Game Boy type a holder platform and and be protected by stealthware, and also know where other people are in the forest or wherever, and they can tell guns, and they can hit a button and a gun automatically blows up these people. I mean, this is a very high-tech, brilliant form of warfare, and women are right in there.
I just should explain right now that I would like to put that question to Jade McGlynn as well. But since she is in Kharkiv, it's a very precarious situation for her. And she did explain before we started this that there were air raids signals that were cutting through her connection with us. So I think hopefully she's all right. And we're hoping that if she comes back, that she can join the conversation again. But that's just to explain her absence for the moment. We'll keep trying and get communications with her and bring her back in as and when we can. So Diane, thank you very much for answering that for us. The late Victoria Amelina, an award-winning novelist and children's author, she completely changed her life after the full-scale invasion of Russia. She wanted to document the atrocities of war, and she set up this human rights group, Truth Hounds. Now, I know that you're a very strong believer and campaigner for human rights, and that yourself, you are, as a journalist, you were the first editor of a national newspaper in Canada. So I presume you're very aware of this woman. How do you think Ukrainian women will emerge from this war once the fighting stops?
It's interesting. I think they will end up running the country. And the reason I say that is not because they're more capable or domineering. It's because the loss of men in the war. I mean, we're talking about the decimation of a big portion of the current generation up to the age of 60 of males. And, these women are going to raise their children on their own, many of them, and not even necessarily in the country, but they're going to come back and they're going to have to build the bridges and start the businesses and all of that sort of thing. All you have to do is look at Germany after the Second World War. Their males were completely decimated in that war. And women were running everything. They were the mayors, they were the cops, they were the school teachers, they were the members of parliament. And so this is just what's going to happen. And fortunately, they're ready to take control if they need to.
It's interesting, Diane, because, for already a very strongly feminist culture that you mentioned earlier, that's going to be even more so, you think, once the fighting stops.
Yes, well, let's hope so. And I think that feminist culture is the only just culture globally.
Let's talk about the way Russian women, wives and mothers and daughters have been impacted by this war. Their public protests are being tolerated at the moment, or they're showing in public, but not the journalists who report on them. How is this movement expressing itself? And is anybody listening?
You're talking about protests inside Ukraine?
In Russia.
Oh, in Russia. Well, that's just horrific. With facial recognition and a Stalinist administration, anybody who goes out and protests alone as being heroic. The turnout for his funeral was paltry. By comparison, when an election was rigged in 2008 in Ukraine, millions of people turned out on the streets for days to get it overturned. They have a very strong civil society because they are a united, unique ethnic group, and collaborative ethnic group, whereas in Russia, you don't. Now you have the white, I think they call it the white scarf movement, and they wear scarves and they put things over their faces because they're going to be targeted if they protest.
Jade, good to see that you're back with us. I was a bit concerned when you disappeared after you told us earlier about how your signal was being cut out by what happened. Was it an air raid signal siren?
I'm not sure. Normally it happens because an air raid has just been announced or because an air raid is coming, but
Are you okay to stay on the call with us?
Yes, of course.
I mean, we got to the point when your line went where I was going to ask you a little bit about the instances that you're aware of Ukrainian women helping subvert the Russian war effort. What stories do you know about?
There's so many stories. It's almost really difficult to know where to start. I think in particular, when you think about the sort of the strategic narrative, but also as well in the occupied territories, which is the focus of my research at the moment. And you hear of lots of stories in particular of how essentially it's been worked out that the Russians don't suspect pretty young women who get their nails done and have all of their, and have their hair and everything. And so some of these women who seem like perhaps the least likely resistance fighters have managed to both smuggle in terms of phones, in terms of sometimes equipment, but also just to get information out, for example, to the Ukrainian special operations forces that work with the partisans within the occupied territories. And there's a particular story about a lady in Kherson, which can now be told because, of course, Kherson has been liberated, and she had managed to smuggle, even help to smuggle out so many different phones, which are what's needed in order for both operations to take place, because they have kind of burner phones, but also in order for people to get targets, and for people to send targets, information about where the Russian occupying forces are. And also that she had managed herself to pass over, an incredible amount of information, sometimes really right under the noses of the Russians as well. But because she was very sort of prim and proper and always had her hair perfectly blow dried, for some reason, the Russians, I guess because of an inbuilt patriarchal system, just never suspected this woman who did some really incredible things.
A few poisonings in the occupied territories, and I have to think that women have more access to the kitchens.
Nicely put. Actually, Jade, while you were gone, Diane and I were reflecting about the future of Ukraine and women's place in Ukraine and society after the war. And Diane was saying that women will run Ukraine. How do you think this experience is going to change the way Ukrainian women are in society going forward? Because many of them have changed their lives exponentially. It's completely changed them, overhaul what they do to be part of this.
I mean, in some ways, I don't know how much it will change it, because in general, I mean, my admittedly male Ukrainian friends always say to me, oh, women are always the head of the household in Ukraine anyway. Traditionally, there are so many women in power, in the Verkhovna Rada. And so in some ways, I wonder how much it really will change, because I do think that, as somebody who's obviously spent a lot of time here, but also lived for a long time in Russia, I do find that one of the key distinctions is that women here, not just in private, but in public, very confident that their voice should be heard. And I think that the gender relations, to put it mildly, are a lot healthier here than they are in Russia. I think after the war, then, I mean, I think that, of course, women will continue to occupy key positions, but I do think there'll be a very particular role to be played by, the so-called party of the ZSO, whoever comes to kind of represent the military's interests as well. And I hope that doesn't lead to the sidelining of women. But to be honest with you, I don't really think it will, given the female input into the military.
Jade, let's just talk now about the way Russian women, wives, mothers, and daughters have also been impacted by this war. Their public protests are being tolerated, but not the journalists who report on them. How is this movement expressing itself? And is anybody actually listening?
I think that it's definitely important insofar as it, any kind of horizontal organization within society is good. It will leave it's something that doesn't happen very much in Russia. The extent to which how much everybody else is listening is perhaps a more difficult question. When you look into it, it seems like there's a broad sympathy for their protests, but not really much support. And that's completely understandable, because if you support their aims, i.e. to have their husbands and brothers, etc., rotated out, then that means there'd be a new wave of mobilization, and then other people's husbands and brothers and sons might be mobilized in. And I think it speaks back to that broader point that Anna Politkovskaya, the female journalist who was obviously who was assassinated, her true killers have never been found, though many have their own suspicions, obviously. She wrote about how in Russia, one of the big difficulties for creating, I suppose, that kind of public consciousness of Russian people's rights, of their human rights, is that Russians can complain about what's happening in their cell, but they don't realize that what's happening in the next cell, first of all, they don't care about it. And secondly, they don't realize that it's connected to what's happening in their cell. And until this interconnectedness of the cells and the suffering in each of them becomes understood, then there's going to be a real barrier to creating a true Russian civil society that's politically engaged across all levels. And I think that right now that still perhaps feels further away than ever.
The treatment, Diane, of the mother of Alexei Navalny, Putin's fiercest opposition politician until his death and incarceration, it struck a chord with anybody who's ever lost a child, and even more so, given the horrifying circumstances and the way that she was reported as having to search around, trying to find his body, the conditions in which she was told it would or will not be released for burial. It was brutal. How could society actually tolerate seeing that public, or was there no awareness of that in Russia, do you think, at the time?
Well, I think that information is strictly controlled, but it's kind of ironic, but cruel that he allowed the parents to see Navalny in jail a week and a half before they killed him. I don't know whether that was a good thing for them or a bad thing for them, but it's kind of a weird, twisted behavior. And the negotiations over the body, where and how, and so on and so forth, was awful. And all of these things are theater, political theater on the part of Putin, designed to look on the one hand like he likes mothers, and on the other hand, beware, because we're in control and we can do exactly what we want to you and your loved ones. And so it was part of his twisted political theater. And that's why the White Scarves, which I think they're called, has been a fairly successful protest movement, the mothers of the soldiers. And they are not being arrested and dragged into jail, but they are also not going too far.
Jade, his widow, Yulia Navalny, has vowed to continue his work. Will that chime with Russian women? Is there even the slightest hunger by women for representation by women at a higher level politically?
I think that it's unlikely to really resonate with broad swathes of the types of people, the types of women, or people more largely that would need to be targeted. I think that unfortunately there's an issue that the Russian liberal opposition has, even sometimes with agreeing with itself, even when abroad. And I think that what we've seen has been a failure, admittedly under incredibly difficult circumstances, now more difficult than ever, but a failure to find a common language, a way of talking with the types of Russians to whom Putin's rhetoric does appeal. And I would say that I don't think that the Russian liberal opposition are unique there. I think we can think of other countries where polarization or disagreement has led to just a desire to not engage with people on the other side of the camp, perhaps for completely understandable reasons, but they're ultimately very, very damaging for democracy, because those people exist. And if reasonable people don't talk to them and engage in conversation with them, then unreasonable demagogues will, or in Russia's case, Putin.
Russia is run by a plutocracy of toxic masculinity white guys. That's what it is. And they discriminate against everybody else.
When we hear conversations about potential candidates to succeed Putin, one woman who put herself forward, the former TV journalist Yekaterina Duntsova, was rejected over flaws in her application. The last woman leader of Russia was Catherine the Great. Is there any chance, I think I know what Diane's answer would be to this, but I'll ask you, Jade, is there any chance we could see a woman lead Russia, and could that be the change Russia needs?
Well, based on Catherine the Great, maybe not, given that Dorothea starts with her. So probably the answer's there.
Yeah.
Diane, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, well, I agree with her. Catherine the Great was one of the guys. The point is that this is larger than just the feminist question. This is also about ethnic groups throughout Russia who are disproportionately recruited and killed in the war as cannon fodder. Their sons are getting mobilized. The white ethnic Russian in Moscow and St. Petersburg kids are not getting drafted. And so there's nobody in the roster of the inner circle of Putin that's female, and there never has been. There's a couple of star journalists, sort of disinformation people who stand out, but they're token. This is not a female friendly place yet.
Jade, you mentioned earlier about the forcible deportation of children from Ukraine to Russia, estimates of around 20,000 children. And the one thing that really staggers me when I read about this is how any woman, any mother could actually take one of those children in Russia, knowing that they've been taken away from their mothers, taking someone else's child. How is that made to be acceptable to them? Because to me, the only way I can explain it is that perhaps they've been indoctrinated to such an extent that they believe they're doing the right thing. How do you counter that?
So I think, yes, in many cases, there are a lot of women who think that they're taking in, Ukrainian orphans, first of all, and they see, it's a common phrase in Russia, we didn't start this war, but we're going to finish it. So they see themselves as the good guys here, and everybody likes to see themselves as the good guys. So there's perhaps nothing surprising in that. So they wouldn't necessarily understand the actions in the same way we would. So we can see it with Maria Lvova-Belova, who's wanted by the ICC for her involvement in the deportation of Ukrainian children. She herself has adopted or stolen, children, a child from the occupied territories of Ukraine, and you can look at the way she explained it, and I mean, a lot of this you can just read it. I mean, they're very open about what they're doing. There's no shame or horror for them involved in it. They're proud of what they're doing. They think they're doing something good. I must say there's also a much darker element, which is that Russian families who take in Ukrainian orphans, and in particular disabled Ukrainian orphans, receive a lot of money. And there have been cases, you can read about them on Sprotiv, which is a Ukrainian resistance website. There have been many cases of very upsetting mistreatment of the orphans and of the disabled orphans, because essentially the families have taken them in just for money.
Let's just talk a little bit about Ukrainian politics and the future of women there. I spoke to a woman recently called Alyona Khlivko, who became one of Ukraine's youngest ever MPs. She's now based in London, and she left politics, she told me, because of the corruption. She couldn't take it anymore. This was some years ago, but is Ukraine emerging, do you think, irrespective of the pressures of the war, to becoming having a more transparent form of politics?
Yeah, as I said, I started going there in 92, and I worked for 30 years with the anti-corruption movements there, writing about it, helping them and that sort of thing, raising funds. Corruption was rampant. It's not necessarily cultural. It was imposed on them because of Russian influence, and they just actually adopted the Russian model, which was to carve up the country among a few oligarchs who really ran everything. And so you had a situation where corruption was terrible. It still exists. It's still there. However, It's being cracked down on wherever it can be, despite a war going on. There's been a couple of scandals uncovered, which are pretty awful. People, stealing money that should have gone to the army. And, they will eventually join the European Union. And like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and other former Soviet influenced countries that were totally corrupt by the Russian system, they will get out from under this because they have signed the protocols. The Europeans will help them establish clean institutions, corruption-free institutions, judiciary in their public services, and so on. And in terms of governing their antitrust and their economy. So that will eventually happen. But culturally, I don't see the same kind of corruption among Ukrainians that you see in other parts of Russian Federation.
Yulia Navalny has called upon Russians to demonstrate on the day of the presidential election in Russia, which is fast approaching. She said, we need to use the election day to show that we exist and there are many of us. We are real, living people, and we are against Putin. Jade, do you think that will resonate in Russia?
I hope so, and I hope people go out. But on another point, part of me, I guess, again, we've been speaking about Ukrainian heroism. Part of me feels really sad that that's all that can be done is people can turn out at 12, compared to that's not going to do anything to bring down Putin. And people continue to die, women continue to have to be heroes, babies continue to die because a lot of Russians are pretty indifferent or choose to look away. So without in any way wanting to criticize the initiative, because I think it's a good and useful thing. I think it does speak to a broader failure of Russian opposition to Putin over the last 24 years, that's led us to this very, very, very tragic place.
And Diane, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that message will resonate?
Well, I think it'll be heard. I think a few brave souls will go out there and probably pay a terrible price for it. Let's also remember, it's not strictly a matter of choice. This is brainwashing, intimidation that's gone on decades. This is a very damaged nationality, in my opinion, because of the way that Putin has imposed a Stalinism. The figures of people arrested and imprisoned since he's been in power exceed what Stalin did. And so it's a reign of terror. And so I have to be sympathetic with Russians who just say, I don't want to know about it. I can't get involved in it. It's too frightening.
We set up at the beginning of this saying that the reason we're talking about these subjects is to coincide with International Women's Day. If I could just put it to both of you finally to end, what will you be thinking of when you're thinking about the women in Ukraine and the women affected by this war on International Women's Day? Diane, do you want to go first? And Jade, do you want to finish?
I pray for all of them.
I'll be thinking of my friend Solomia. Her dad and her brother both serve on the front, and she does everything she can, both for them, but also just in general for Ukraine. And she's just this incredibly beautiful, incredibly fragile woman. But the things she gets up to and that she's got up to since 2014 are staggering. And yet even within all of that, she finds the time to be able to sometimes calm me down when I'm upset. So that generosity of spirit, courage, bravery, and the way she does it so unassumingly, I'll be thinking about her.
It's a very special country.
Thank you to both of you. Diane Francis, Jade McGlynn, thank you very much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now or listen to Times Radio or go to thetimes.co.uk. My thanks to our producer today, Morgan Burdick, and to you for watching. Bye-bye for now.